So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be looking at a story out of the Gospel of Mark. A couple weeks ago, we looked at one of the healing stories in which a blind man named Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus, calling him the Son of David. And this kind of recognition that he is in the tradition of David, that he is the Messiah, is going to start kind of a chain of tellings in which Jesus heads to Jerusalem. The next story, right after Bartimaeus being healed of his blindness, is what's called the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry is Jesus. He rides on a donkey in a manner that would have been the traditional way for a king to enter the city in peace. It's a big piece of street theater. It is a very strong public statement of who he is claiming to be the Messiah. He then uses that momentum to go into the temple area and basically smash up the way that they are practicing kind of everyday religion. He knocks over all these money changers. He gets rid of the animals that would have been used in sacrifices. He kind of condemns the economic side of the way religion was being practiced at this point, which leads to this kind of big public confrontation between Jesus and all these different types of religious leaders, because he basically ticks off everybody by challenging the status quo and by claiming who he is. So one of the more important arguments in the center of that is just, who do you think you are? Like, who do you think you are to be able to challenge this entire system? Because you're kind of acting like the Messiah, but the Messiah should be, a political leader. He should be someone who's impressive and has an army with him. And you waltzed in here, and instead of getting interested in political matters, instead of having an army and being big and inspiring, you go and mess with religious status quo. And you're saying that this is what you are. And Jesus goes back and forth. They argue about, who the Messiah is supposed to be and what they're saying. And Jesus ends kind of all these public debates with this very kind of interesting turn. And then the rest of this chapter, in some ways, shows perspective on how how Jesus is approaching it very differently than everyone else around him. So let me read this section. It's going to feel like three little vignettes, but they're all related in that they are both Jesus claiming to be a very different and specific type of Messiah, saying very different things about God and what is ultimately important. And then we're going to get, in some ways, two illustrations of the ways in which Jesus thinks others might be getting it wrong and looking at the wrong things. So let me read Mark chapter 12, starting at verse 35. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, "Why do the legal experts say that the Christ is David's son?" David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, said, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right side until I turn your enemies into your footstool.' David himself calls him Lord. So how can he be David's son?" The large crowd listened to him with delight. As he was teaching, he said, "Watch out for the legal experts. They like to walk around in long robes. They want to be greeted with honor in the markets. They long for places of honor in the synagogues and at banquets. They are the ones who cheat widows out of their homes, and to show off they say long prayers. They will be judged most harshly." Jesus sat down across from the collection box for the temple treasury and observed how the crowd gave their money. Many rich people were throwing in lots of money, and one poor widow came forward and put in 2 small copper coins worth a penny. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I assure you that this poor widow has put in more than everyone who's been putting money in the treasury. All of them are giving out of their spare change, but she, from her hopeless poverty, has given everything she had, even what she needed to live on." So the approach that Jesus is having is one that's a little tricky for us to culturally understand. It's something that's called midrash, in which people take small sections and kind of embellish on them, kept working on them to say, what else might be here? To this day, it still drives many of us reading it crazy. It drives biblical scholars crazy. It's just a different way of approaching the scripture, of trying to find God in that, right? Because people are like, oh, you're pulling it out of context. That's not what it actually meant, which we do a lot of. We just pick different verses, I guess. But I think what Jesus is trying to do is he's showing the way theology and these sorts of discussions were done. And he's doing it because he's taking a fairly unique passage and using it to kind of challenge their ideas of what the Messiah, the Son of David, the Christ in Greek would have been, right? Because at the time, again, they're mad at him because he doesn't look like what they're expecting for a Messiah. He's not impressive and charismatic. He doesn't have a big following. People aren't listening to him in the same way one would expect, and he doesn't seem to be concerned about the same things. He is very involved and concerned about the political, but he's not going about it on their terms, on their way of doing things, and he's criticizing those who are in power and who have a lot to lose from the way things are, right? And so Jesus, I think, in this, using this kind of midrash tradition, is taking a very interesting psalm, Psalm 110, and he's saying, okay, look, you're expecting David to be a son of David, right? Just like the old man, kind of a smaller version, an understandable version. But I think a bit of the poke at that is the version they had of the Messiah, of the son of David, David couldn't have lived up to, right? It's this idealized version, not recognizing that he's a deeply flawed human being who made some major mistakes, but was also called someone after God's own heart. And so, this ideal of what the Messiah should be, this ideal of what the Son of David, he's saying both that you're thinking about in the wrong direction, but you're also thinking too small, right? The Lord said to my Lord, I, David, think someone bigger and grander is coming. Like, okay, we can get behind that. But what it is actually makes for greatness and grandness is at the heart of what they're disputing in a lot of ways. And that's where this passage is going to go, right? Again, they want a military leader. They want someone to come in, kick Roman butt, and they want the glory days back. But quoting Psalm 110 is also, pretty sneaky on Jesus' part, because a little few verses down, we're going to see a reference to this king, this Messiah, this son of David, taking on religious duties as well. When we get a reference to the Old Testament character of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is this mysterious character that only shows up very briefly interacting with Abraham. He is, at the time, the king of Jerusalem before it's been incorporated into Israel, because at the time there was no Israel. It's just with Abraham at that point. But he's not just the king, he's also high priest of something that is God Most High, referred to in the Old Testament. We don't get much more background than that. And yet he's this very interesting figure because he's not criticized in the Old Testament. And we have these two offices that Israel keeps pretty separate, right? King Saul gets in trouble for trying to act like a priest. And although David is involved pretty heavily in worship, we have to go further back to find a figure who is both king and priest in Melchizedek. And so Jesus is arguing that their view of a political Messiah, their view of a military leader is too small. The Lord said to my Lord, and then again a few verses later, you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek. You are king, you are priest. And therefore Jesus is saying, yes, I have the right to criticize so much of what you're doing. And then again, the interesting thing is not that he's heightening himself, saying, I'm going to take over all these things. He's going to show some examples of why it is the religious establishment and their focuses on the time were on all the wrong things. They're using what greatness they have for the wrong things. And that gives us this next section in which he criticizes them publicly, right? As he was teaching, he said, watch out for legal experts. They like to walk around in long robes. They want to be greeted with honor in the markets. They long for places of honor in synagogues and at banquets. They're the ones who cheat widows out of their homes and show off. They say long prayers. They will be judged most harshly. So one of my convictions is the fact that deeply religious people get so much face time in the Gospels and they don't tend to get along with Jesus very well is a very important warning for those of us who are religious or spiritual or following God in some way, shape, or form now, right? I think that they disagree with Jesus because we can have a tendency to love our paradigms of the way that Jesus should be or God should be acting in the world, rather than the actual thing in our midst. And so I think every time we see Jesus butting heads with religious leaders or practitioners, every time there's a criticism like this, we need to be warned and take it kind of to heart that we need to be careful, because again, I don't think Jesus is trying to be obscure in this section in the ways he's teaching. He recognizes our expectations, whether that's of politics and the king, whether that's of religion and the way God is supposed to work. Our paradigms, our understandings can become kind of a prison in which we're so stuck on our version of things, we can't see what God is actually up to. And so Jesus is teaching from any angle he can, whether it's obscure, whether it's public criticism, whether it's showing the different values in the section we'll get to in a second, that we need to understand God. We need to think about it differently. We need to be teachable. We need to let him break us out of it. And so in this section, as a warning, I think we have to ask ourselves, even though it makes us uncomfortable, what are they getting out of it? What are these religious people getting out of acting in a certain way, on putting on a pretty good show? And in what ways are we maybe attracted to that, in which we have bad ideas of who Messiah is, of how we have bad ideas of what success looks like in God's kingdom? And to drive this point home that we sometimes need to break out, we get this final little scene from Jesus in which kind of this private conversation between him and his disciples is pointed out. So as Jesus sat across from the collection box for the temple treasury and observed how the crowd gave their money, many rich people were throwing in lots of money. And the poor widow came forward and put in 2 small copper coins worth a penny. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I assure you that this poor widow has put in more than everyone who's been putting money in the treasury. All of them are giving out of their spare change, but she, from her hopeless poverty, has given everything she had, even what she needed to live on. So apparently, at this time, as far as we can tell, these temple treasure chests were kind of littered around. There may have been as many as 13 of these things around. And what they were was for buying kind of the worship materials, right? The different animals that were required, the oils that would be used to burn the lamps, etc. So, and people liked to make this big show of putting money in there, and then they could kind of later on claim like, well, the sacrifice today is brought to you by the whatever family because they paid for the animals, etc. I mean, it's almost exactly like the practice we have in a lot of nonprofits or even a lot of churches. If someone gives a lot of money, you can get a little plaque, right? We're glad that you believe in the mission of our community or the zoo or whatever our nonprofit is, but we just want to make sure we made this possible, right? The attitude, again, is, are they about worshiping God and making that possible? Or are they wanting to make sure that their due is, are they wanting to make sure that the game is being played, that people are seeing what it is that they're doing? This showiness to it, of making sure people are good and religious, right, versus what this widow is doing. I think a really important thing from the story is also to recognize, as Americans, as modern Western people, we tend to lean towards utility. We tend to lean towards what works. Like, okay, if the goal here is to buy stuff to make sure worship continues possible, the people giving more money are being more helpful than the little widow, right? You can just buy more stuff with more money. It's not rocket science. But I think that mentality lurks behind so much of what we do in the modern world. Like, well, it's not the ideal, but it's just what we got to do. We got to be realistic. This story, which is a warning that this might be true about God as well, utility's not on here at all. In the end, the showiness of these people undercuts God's value of what their gifts are. He didn't care about the amount, right? He's got all the stuff out there. Worship maybe grinds to a halt, whoop-de-doo, versus this widow, one of the poor widows that was likely mentioned earlier. What is it she has? She gives what she's got. She's not holding anything back, which again is a lot easier to do when she's not showy. When she doesn't have anything that the world would show as value, she can give it away. She can be free in a very different way than these rich people can. And that is what Jesus is pointing out, which again brings us back around to this question of what is What is he like as a Messiah? What does he value? He values the sacrifice, the gift, the heart behind what this woman is doing, rather than all the, the showiness of the rich people giving away, or even if it is useful showiness eventually, if you roll your eyes and say, well, they were doing it for themselves, but now we got more money. If we look the other way from people, religious people like sometimes ourselves, who want to pretend we're more spiritual or more deep or more profound or more put together than we actually are, right? Jesus doesn't value any of those things. He says here, I'm the kind of Messiah who values this poor widow giving everything she's got. I see that. I recognize she's bringing what she has, and that is more valuable because it cost her something. And so, are those 2 pennies going to get God much? Are they going to get the temple much? No. And yet, Jesus is willing to throw down their entire system, make it stop working for the sake of championing people like this small widow. And so I just think we need to ask ourselves some questions about, okay, where in the world do we see this posturing, this show to make people see us or others a certain way? Um, what are those rankings? What is it that's valuable? What are we vying for? And do we value those things, even if accidentally? Would we rather be thought of as impressive or influential or powerful or rich than easy to dismiss, and yet sacrificially giving and doing the thing we're supposed to? What are the rewards, and what are the people who are viewed as losers in our culture? How do we see them? Do we see people like this poor widow as the most valuable, as those that most impress God because of the state of their hearts? And if this is what Jesus is saying here, what kind of a Messiah is he? What kind of a king is it we say we're following? And then, of course, the scary implication is, what does that say about God? What do these stories tell us about what God is actually like versus maybe the version of God we find haunting so many of our understandings? What about those 2 pennies? What is it that we might be needing to sacrifice and let go of and give up to God? And do we frankly have a view of God in which he's worth any sacrifice, big or small, on our part? I think those are some of the questions I find myself wrestling with in this section, wondering what kind of a Messiah Jesus was, wondering what kind of a God it is we follow.